Hello, and welcome to Cutting Through. I'm Mitchell Plitnick. Um, Democrats are being forced now to reckon with the cost of their stubborn support for Israel's genocide in 2024. They did a report on the loss of that election. They call it autopsy, and that report was buried, and it's a fair bet as to why. Now we're finding out that it was indeed, at least in part, probably in large part, because it reveals the Democrats' failure on the issue of the genocide in Gaza. So, what does this mean for the Democrats? Lately, we've been hearing Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer giving speeches to pro-Israel groups, saying that his main focus is to make sure that Israel gets as much aid as possible. We're seeing all sorts of, sort of quiet leanings. I recently reported on how the Democratic leadership in the House is sort of quietly trying to bury the War Powers Act resolution that is being brought by Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie to stop Donald Trump from being able to just unilaterally declare war on Iran. So it doesn't look like the Democrats have learned a lot. So there's a lot to dig into here. And joining me to discuss this is someone I'm proud to call a longtime friend and colleague, Professor Josh Ruebner. Josh is an adjunct lecturer in Georgetown University's program on justice and peace and a faculty fellow at Georgetown University's Center for Social Justice Research. He received his PhD in Palestine studies at the University of Exeter's European Center for Palestine Studies. His thesis is entitled A Tragedy of Catastrophic Proportions, the United States and the Palestinian Nakba, 1947 to 1949. Josh, I understand you'll be publishing that soon, and I can't wait to read it. Josh has written a couple of books, called Shattered Hopes, Obama's Failure to Broker Israeli-Palestinian Peace, and Israel, Democracy or Apartheid State. He is the policy director at the Institute for Middle East Understanding Policy Project, which is just doing incredible work right now, really. IMEUpolicyproject.org. You should really follow what they're doing. And has previously worked at Americans for Justice in Palestine Action, the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and the Congressional Research Service. So welcome, Josh, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me on, Mitchell. Really appreciate it.
So let's get right to it. Supporters of Palestinian rights were arguing in 2024 while the campaign was going on that Kamala Harris was shooting herself in the foot with her treatment of not only the genocide in Gaza, but also of Palestinian Americans, who she was shutting out of the Democratic National Convention. And now the Democratic National Committee seems to have this in their face, like it's just being forced upon them. But it seems like they'd rather bury the report than learn something from it. And I understand IMEU heard directly from some DNC officials about this. So what have you learned? And also, please let folks know what IMEU's own polling has uncovered about this question of the impact of Gaza on Harris's loss.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll back up the story a little bit to before the Democratic National Convention took place last summer or 2 summers ago in Chicago. We commissioned polling in the key swing states of Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. And we found that for every voter that Kamala Harris would have lost if she had called for an arms embargo on Israel, she would have gained between 3 and 5 voters in these swing states. So we showed this data to her campaign and to the Democratic Party and to delegates to the DNC. The warnings that we provided at that point, showing that breaking with Biden's policies would actually be an electoral asset for her, were ignored. And then after she lost, we did another public opinion poll. And we specifically drilled down and we asked voters nationwide who voted for Biden in 2020 and who did not vote for Harris in 2024, why? What caused them to not vote for Harris in 2024?
So that includes people who voted for Trump and people who just didn't vote at all.
No,
right?
all people who voted for Biden.
Right, but people who voted for Biden in 2020, but then in 2024 either voted for Trump or another candidate or didn't vote at all. Is
Correct,
that okay?
correct. And so we asked those voters what was the number one consideration for why Harris did not get your vote. And the answer was not healthcare. It was not the economy. It was not women's reproductive rights. It was Gaza. Gaza was the number one reason cited by people who did not vote for Harris in 2024, who did vote for Biden in 2020, why they cast their vote that way. And the percentages were even higher amongst voters in key swing states that she needed to win to capture the victory over Trump. So we shared this public opinion poll with the DNC. We engaged with representatives of the DNC and different elected delegates to it. And when we learned that the DNC was doing this postmortem about why the party lost the 2024 elections, we made sure that they had our data and we had conversations with them. And at the time we had the conversations with the DNC, we were definitely under the impression that their data matched ours. They
Mm.
were quite clear in that regard, actually. So we have very good evidence that the DNC actually has data showing that Kamala Harris lost, at least in part, because of her refusal to break from Biden's disastrous support for Israel's genocide. And this Axios story just came out recently, basically affirming that the
Yeah.
DNC does indeed have that data. So, this is part of a broader story that we're trying to tell as we go into the midterms, that Israel is an electoral liability
Yeah.
for Democrats. And supporting Palestinian human rights is actually an electoral asset for Democratic candidates. And we're seeing unprecedented numbers of Democrats who are refusing to take AIPAC money. There are now more than 200 candidates who are running on a platform to support the Block the Bombs legislation in Congress. This is really unprecedented that you have all these insurgent Democratic candidates running specifically on a platform promoting Palestinian rights as a way to differentiate themselves from the others and the incumbents that they're challenging.
I mean, it seems like AIPAC itself agrees with your findings when they're looking to support a candidate, or on the flip side, oppose another one, try to block another one who might be progressive from getting into Congress. They'll do these massive ad campaigns and pump all this money, and they'll talk about every subject in the world except Israel. They will not mention Israel. Even they seem to realize that Israel is a political liability, as you said.
Absolutely, they do. And I don't think they've realized the extent to which they've become so toxic
Mhm.
in American politics in general, and specifically within the Democratic Party. Very, very few candidates want to have anything to do with AIPAC right now because they're seen, rightfully so, as an organization that advocates for the unconditional provision of these billions and billions of dollars of weapons to Israel to inflict genocide against Palestinians. And more than that, they backed more than 100 members of Congress who supported Trump's insurrection
Mhm.
in
Right.
2020. So they're just seen as this very, very toxic entity within the base of the Democratic Party right now for these two reasons. And then another reason why they're seen as so toxic is because a lot of their billionaire donor network are Trump supporters,
Right.
right? And so the way that this dark money works is that unlimited amounts of money can be put into super PACs to meddle in internal party primaries, right? So you have Trump billionaire donors who are putting in millions and millions of dollars into Democratic primaries and trying to affect the outcome. And that's why so many Democratic politicians and so many Democratic activists are trying to get this baleful influence of super PAC money out of the primaries,
Right.
because it's corrupting our politics in general, but it's also allowing for Republicans to swoop in and impact the trajectory of Democratic elections as well.
So, given all of that, I mean, I think we can, at least I can understand somebody like Chuck Schumer, who I think is ideologically disposed to Israel in a very personal way. And I think maybe the same can be said about Joe Biden. But how do we explain somebody, I mean, in Schumer's case, he's Jewish and comes from the Jewish pro-Israel tradition that those of you and I both being Jewish, we're very familiar with. But how do we explain somebody like Hakeem Jeffries, who seems still to be, completely devoted to this line of thinking, or even somebody, Kamala Harris, who, granted, for years was certainly, well liked by the AIPAC crowd, but you know, I don't think, and her husband, of course, is pro-Israel, although I think she actually seems more pro-Israel even than he is, or more fanatical about it anyway than he is. How do we explain the centrist politicians in the Democratic Party who are still towing the Israel line when it's clearly so unpopular?
Well, I think they're going to be in a for very rude awakening in the midterms. I think we're going to see the elections of dozens of insurgent Democrats who are rejecting AIPAC money and who are rejecting any form of support for Israel.
Mhm.
So I think that this kind of reflects a dinosaur old school mentality that still exists among pockets of the Democratic Party. There was a lot of criticism of what Senator Sanders calls the consultant class
Right.
within the Democratic Party that adheres to this very old fashioned sense
Mhm.
of how Democrats get elected. And for many, many decades, it was a truism that you had to placate the Israel lobby and AIPAC in particular in order to stand a good chance of getting elected. And that's simply not where American politics are today anymore. It's moved beyond that. Uh, the dam is broken, and I don't think there is, to mix metaphors, I don't think there's any way of putting the genie back in the bottle. Not after 2 years of live stream genocide.
Yeah.
No Democrats see a real path to victory by embracing AIPAC and by embracing the Israel narrative. Just to make this very concrete, you see Laura Fine, for example,
Right.
in the open seat for Illinois 9,
Mhm.
uh, staking out her lane as the pro-Israel, pro-AIPAC candidate. And right now, according to public opinion polls, she's running a distant third in
Distant
that
third, yeah.
race. A distant third. So it's a very, very unpopular position, and it's going to be increasingly difficult for any Democrat to get elected on a pro-Israel, pro-AIPAC agenda.
Yeah, I think we can look at New Jersey 11, what happened to Tom Malinowski, who tried to sort of be I don't know if you want to say moderate pro-Israel. He tried to be the not quite all the way to AIPAC candidate, but definitely still very pro-Israel. And AIPAC actually turned on him just for moving just that little bit away from them. So it seems like they're going to target anyone who's not absolutely in line with their views, and that seems like a surprisingly, to me anyway, short-sighted strategy for an organization that before now, I think they've changed, but historically was a lot more politically clever, I think, than they are today.
Yeah, I think it really speaks to the point I made earlier about AIPAC not even realizing how toxic it has become. They dumped more than $2 million in independent expenditures into this campaign to criticize Malinowski for daring to believe that we shouldn't provide a blank check to
Mhm.
Israel, that maybe there should be some conditions and restrictions on this amount of money. And by making this expenditure against Tom Malinowski and decreasing his popularity in this race, that was one of the factors that led to Ana Lilia Mejia's victory. And this is someone
Exactly.
who calls Israel's actions a genocide and supports arms embargo on Israel. And that's not to take anything away from the amazing campaign that she ran, but AIPAC certainly face planted in their strategy in this election. And we may be seeing a repeat of this in Illinois 9 as well.
The one thing that I guess still concerns me about all of this is one of the things that I confronted in 2024 was people who were very much, I mean, this included some people who identified themselves as anti-Zionist, and were definitely, supportive of Palestinian rights and opposed to AIPAC, et cetera, still saying, well, but we have to vote for because once it came down to Harris versus Trump, we have to vote for Harris because Trump will be, just so horrible on everything, not just Palestine. Actually, I think we could we could say that he has been so much worse than even the worst Democrat could have been on many issues. Although on this one, I'm not sure how much worse he really is than Biden was. Genocide mostly happened on Biden's watch. But be that as it may, that argument, I think, carried a certain weight, and it felt like it was ripping apart at least parts of the Palestine solidarity movement, because there were those people that said, yeah, this is terrible, but I got to bite the bullet and vote for Harris, and others saying, I will not vote for somebody who is complicit in genocide. Do you think, first of all, do you think that that might happen again in 2028, that sort of divide? And if yes, I mean, how do we, or how did you in 2024 kind of, navigate that?
Yeah, I definitely understand how people could come down on either side of the issue in terms of feeling that they couldn't vote for Harris because of the Biden administration's support for genocide, or people who felt like it was the lesser of two evils to vote for Harris. I think a lot of it depends on what state you're living in, to be honest, and what position you take, right? It's a very, very different consideration to make that decision if you're living in a state like California than in a state like Virginia, where I live, where it can be a toss up between Democrats and Republicans, right? So some people have more flexibility in terms of knowing how much their vote will or will not count because of the peculiarities of our crazy electoral college system.
Right.
So I'll say that, but I'll say in regards to 2028, look, I think that we are going to create the conditions so that any viable Democratic candidate for president will have to support Palestinian rights. I think that is the trajectory of public opinion within the Democratic Party. And I find it very, very hard to believe, just like we're talking about Democrats having increasing trouble running as pro-Israel, pro-AIPAC Democrats in the midterms, I think it'll be even more so for the presidential elections in 2028. I don't see a credible path to anyone getting that nomination if they are supportive of Israel.
I think that's right. I guess one of the places that I worry about this repeating itself is, you know, many people are kind of counting Benjamin Netanyahu out in the next election in Israel, which is going to happen in October, as you know. Um, I refuse to count that man out. He's looked like he was politically dead so many times in his career, and he's come back. But for a second, let us assume that indeed Netanyahu does lose the premiership in Israel. He's going to be replaced almost certainly by Naftali Bennett. Bennett's politics, as far as not just Palestine but the whole Middle East, region, his external politics are no different than Netanyahu. Bennett himself is very supportive of settlers. He has in the past been someone who attacked Netanyahu from the right. He's only kind of trying to make himself more moderate now because he's part of this anti-Netanyahu coalition. But I fear that just somebody not, so much of this has focused on Netanyahu as the catalyst for all of Israel's genocide, of its hostility toward its neighbors, its bombing of Lebanon, invasion of Syria, bombing of Iran, etc. That if Bennett is in there, even if his policies are just as bad, he'll be a better face. He won't be Netanyahu, and that will give the pro-Israel forces an opening to kind of rehabilitate Israel's image, which I think they're already trying to do. Do you have any concerns? I don't know that that's what would happen, but and I think Israel's image is so horrible that maybe nothing can redeem it, because I think people have seen what Israel is. It is the apartheid state that you described it as in your book. But do you have any of those kinds of concerns?
Yeah, definitely. And, so much of the conflict between US policy priorities and Israel have been personalized around Netanyahu. You can
Hmm.
take this all the way back even to the Clinton administration when there were these, severe clashes between President Clinton and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over the progress of the Oslo Accords at the time. But this personalization really went to another level when Netanyahu went behind President Obama's back to address Congress and attempt to scuttle the nuclear agreement with Iran that he
Hmm.
had signed. And so Netanyahu's always been, since that point in time, in particular, a convenient boogeyman
Yeah.
for Democrats, especially, who attribute all of the atrocities that Israel commits to Netanyahu. And of course, Netanyahu is responsible for those atrocities as the government, the head of the government that he leads. However, it is a more systemic problem, right? Israel is inflicting apartheid against the Palestinian people from the river to the sea. Israel has been denying Palestinian refugees their right to return home for now 3/4 of a century. And that's not a function of who is the Israeli prime minister. That's something that's supported across the Israeli political spectrum.
Hmm.
Uh, and of course, this personalization of Netanyahu and focusing the problem as if it's only on him detracts from the whole settler colonial ideology of Zionism, which has attempted to erase the Palestinian people from their homeland since its inception in the
Hmm.
late 19th century. So those are all the problems with personalizing the issue with Netanyahu. I have no doubt that Bennett would pursue same or similar policies to Netanyahu in terms of attempting to continue Israel's efforts to erase the Palestinian people. But yes, I do have that fear that if there were a different Israeli prime minister in place, it would somewhat reduce the frictions and the tensions
Yeah.
that exist currently.
Yeah, I think that that sort of speaks to what you were saying and how important it is. I think this moment is really crucial for people who support just whether it's Palestinian rights or just universal human rights, to really seize this moment and make sure that the Democratic Party is moved in that other direction, following what is overwhelmingly its base at this point. Uh, I think one of the things that I want to kind of zoom out a little bit, because one of the things that I've argued since 2024 is that Gaza became not just, uh, and I don't want to minimize it at all, but not just the question of the ethical questions of genocide and apartheid and settler colonialism and all the things that we are de facto supporting if we're supporting Israel in its actions or in its so-called defense. Um, but it became, I think, for many voters, it became a symbol of how the Democratic leadership wasn't listening to them, wasn't paying attention to them. Whether it was Gaza or some other issue, they were saying, we're telling you what we want. We're telling you what's going to get our vote. And you're just saying, well, I'm going to do this, and you have to sort of sit back and like it. Otherwise, you get this, Trump. I just wonder how I feel like it became that as well. I feel like Gaza became sort of the symbol of that too. I just wonder your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think Gaza and Democratic Party support for Israel uh, not only epitomizes the disconnect between the sort of corporate centrist leadership of the party and its base that wants a more progressive politics, but I think it is actually the seminal issue where there is the most fundamental disconnect
Hmm.
between the party and its base. But we can see that on other issues as well, like the demand for universal health care, for student debt relief, for any number of issues that are really plaguing this country and really speak to the heart of why we cannot take care of the human needs of people here at home. And I think also when Americans see the United States having endless billions and billions of dollars to give to Israel to inflict genocide against Palestinians, when that same amount of money, by the way, Mitchell, could have been used to house every unhoused person
Yeah.
in the United States.
Yep.
That would cost an estimated $14 billion, if I'm
Hmm.
not mistaken. And Congress appropriated $18 billion of weapons to Israel. So why do we not have money for SNAP, for food assistance to people
Hmm.
who are going hungry, right? Why is it that 20% of children go to bed hungry every night in this country, in this wealthy country of ours? Yet we have $18 billion to give to weapons to Israel to commit genocide. Trump is now talking about nearly doubling the Department of War's
Yeah.
budget. And I'm so glad that they renamed it the Department of War because I think it's much more accurate,
Yeah, much more honest. Yeah.
much more honest. Yeah, truth in this packaging of it. And
Hmm.
so, how is it that we have 1.5 trillion dollars
Hmm.
for war in this country, but not money for human needs? So, yeah, I do think that this lockstep support for Israel's genocide really epitomized everything that was wrong
Yeah.
about the priorities of our federal budget.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
In a similar way that AIPAC in many ways is epitomizing everything that's wrong with our political system. But yeah, again, and I want to just ask this sort of one last question, as I don't want to keep you too long. Your book, Shattered Hopes, which documented the Obama administration and its failures in Israel and Palestine. I've always felt like it kind of dovetailed very nicely with the book that I co-authored with Mark Lamont Hill, except for Palestine. Both of them focused on the Democrats, I think, much more than Republicans. And I'm sure you've gotten the questions that I've gotten. Why are you so, okay, the Democrats suck, but why are you focusing so much just on the Democrats? Look at how awful the Republicans are. And my answer always has been the Republicans are doing what they kind of should do. They're a party of Christian Zionists. They're a party of fascists. They're a party of ultra conservatives or racists, neoconservatives. That's who's making up the party. That's who, so their ideology around Israel actually kind of reflects the party itself, or at least it has in the past. Whereas I think we expect Democrats to do better. So I wonder if you agree with that perspective, and also what you think of the fact that that may actually be changing in with young Republicans these days, as polling seems to show that they agree with you that Israel shouldn't be getting this money. Even those who are pro-Israel are saying we shouldn't be giving them money. They're a first world economy. What do they need our money for? And others who there are Republicans. I know sometimes those of us on the left have a hard time seeing it, but there are Republicans who are repulsed by genocide and apartheid as well.
Yeah.
So just what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, very true. I mean, that was another public opinion poll that we commissioned, and we looked at
Mhm.
GOP sentiment towards funding taxpayer allocations of money to provide weapons to Israel. And we found not only a solid chunk of all Republican voters who were opposed to that idea, but actually a majority of young GOP voters under age 45 oppose the idea of selling or giving weapons
Mhm.
to Israel. So, yes, there's a partisan divide, but there's also increasingly a generational difference in terms of how Palestine, Israel is looked at amongst not only Democrats, but Republicans as well.
Mhm.
So, there are definitely cracks in the Republican and MAGA base when it comes to Israel. We obviously see that being expressed very, very publicly through the likes of Tucker Carlson, for example. Uh, you know, but the reason why I chose to focus my first book on the Obama administration is because President Obama entered the White House with a more sympathetic understanding
Mhm. Mhm.
of the plight of the Palestinian people than any other president entering the White House, bar none, including the late President Jimmy Carter.
Mhm.
President Obama had the lived experience of being friends with Palestinians in his Chicago district that he represented in the Illinois State Senate before he was elected to the United States Senate. And he was very familiar with the history of the Palestinian people. And there was, because of that interaction and background, a lot of hope that Obama would represent a fundamental break in U.S. policies toward Israel and the Palestinians. And I'll say, to his credit, he had the right strategy at the outset of his administration. If you remember back to his early days in office, he insisted that Israel must completely freeze settlements, no ifs, ands, or buts, before negotiations were restarted.
Mm-hmm.
That was a principled position, and it was the right position because all during the Clinton and the George H.W. Bush years, the United States had arm twisted the Palestinians into negotiations over the future of the West Bank and Gaza as Israel was continuing to colonize it.
Mm-hmm.
So Obama did take this new approach. He did get rid of the pro-Israel bureaucrats that had populated the Clinton and the H.W. Bush administrations and who were responsible for this very biased policy. And instead, he appointed George Mitchell, the former Senate Majority Leader, as his special envoy for Middle East peace on his first full day in office.
Mm-hmm.
Now, think about who George Mitchell was. Not only was he the former Senate Majority Leader, but he was someone with Arab American ancestry. And he was the person who brokered the Good Friday Accords that put an end to decades of violence in Northern Ireland. Mm-hmm. And you know what George Mitchell's approach was in the Good Friday Accords? It was everyone had to be brought together around the table, and that included the IRA, which was considered at the time a terrorist organization by the United States. George Mitchell understood that you couldn't leave important actors out of the negotiating process if you were attempting to actually broker a deal that everyone would agree with. I mean, like, this is common negotiating sense, right? So there was a lot of fear amongst Israel and Israel advocates in the United States that George Mitchell was actually going to bring Hamas into the negotiating process and to try to bring together all the sides for meaningful negotiations. Now, of course, he was undercut by some of the same pro-Israel bureaucrats who had peopled the Clinton administration, and ultimately President Obama backed away from this principled stand and allowed Israel to continue to colonize the West Bank with absolutely no accountability. So all the hopes that existed were dashed. I didn't have any hopes for Biden, by the way, because in my book, I talk about how ideologically committed to Zionism Biden was as Obama's vice president. Mm-hmm. Okay. Biden was the first president in the history of the United States to declare himself to be a Zionist.
Yes.
Not even Trump has done that. Only Joe Biden has. Mm-hmm. And Joe Biden gave this remarkable speech. It was to a group of Jewish educators and rabbis in Detroit when he was the vice president. And he talked about how his father sat him down at the kitchen table at a young age and told him about the Holocaust and told him about all the horrific things that occurred against Jewish people in the Nazi genocide in Europe. And he talks about how from that very early age, because of those stories his father tells him, he was a committed Zionist and believed that by supporting Israel, this was the way to salve the conscience of the Christian world for this genocide against Jews in Europe. So this was like the very ideological roots of Biden's support for Israel. He was truly committed to the proposition that the United States should support Israel no matter what, up to and including a genocide.
Yeah. It puts me in mind of another story about Biden that was widely circulated, and I've recirculated it several times when he was a senator in the 80s, and Israel was hitting the PLO in Lebanon. Menachem Begin was the prime minister at the time, and he, Biden talked about how you just hit them, and if you kill the women, you kill the children, you kill all. And Begin, who was not a man inclined towards universalism and human rights, and was certainly a hardened fighter. This is the guy was a wanted terrorist when he was with the Irgun. He rebuked Biden, saying, we don't say those things. Now, he may have meant we don't talk about it openly and we would still do it. But even so, there was a sense, at least in the way the story was relayed, that Begin was kind of appalled that Biden was talking like that. When you can elicit that kind of reaction from somebody like Menachem Begin, who has certainly killed his share of innocent civilians in his time, That says a lot, I think, about Biden. But it also tells us, I agree with you. I had no hopes for Biden either, for the same reason. And my feeling at the time when Obama came in was much like yours. I thought he was doing the right thing. I also, it seemed to me that the pro-Israel forces that undercut him were almost entirely, unlike with the 2015 episode, were almost entirely from his own party. His
Hmm.
own party absolutely sabotaged his attempts at brokering what could have led to some kind of at least better situation than what we ended up with. Yeah, I just if that's what you saw as well, and one, I guess I'm wondering.
It's true, but like LBJ said, what is the point of having political capital if you don't spend it, right?
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
Obama had a tremendous amount of political capital. If you remember, he went to Cairo towards the beginning
Hmm.
of his administration and he announced this new leaf, turning over a new
Yeah.
leaf in terms of US policy and trying to get past the disastrous policies of the George W. Bush administration. And that tremendously resonated
Yes.
with the American people.
Hmm.
And he could have easily stood up and used his bully pulpit to compel fundamental changes in Israel's behavior, but he capitulated. He
Yeah.
capitulated
No,
very
absolutely, he did.
without spending
Absolutely.
political power.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that comes out, by the way, really well in your book. So, I'm going to let you go here and wrap this up. But, I want to remind everyone out there, really, the Institute for Middle East Understanding and Policy Project, imeupolicyproject.org. That's the right website, right? Yeah. IMEU policyproject.org. They are doing really important work. I just want to say I did some consulting work for an organization last year that was asking the question, what should be doing, what should organizations be pursuing that we're not doing in trying to change U.S. policy towards Israel and Palestine. Overwhelmingly, people talked about polling. And it is IMEU that's doing this polling. They're working with YouGov. So it's not just, if you're thinking, oh, I never heard of IMEU, these polls must be really small. No, these are real, these are the polls that we need. They are doing this work. They are coming out with materials that help you understand what's going on. Josh, you had just a brilliant breakdown of that I really recommend people read of what it means that Israel's talking about moving off of the annual U.S. aid and what's really going on there and how that will actually lead to more money and and far less scrutiny of the money that's going to Israel and going to promote war. So just people really check out IMEU, check out Josh's work. It is really brilliant. And Josh, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks so much for having me, Mitchell, and thanks so much for the plug. Really, really appreciate it.
Folks, if you like this, do the like, share, subscribe thing. You're seeing on your screen now how you can support Cutting Through, and I will talk to you soon.